Magdalene. It's a great pleasure and honor to be giving this Lakshman Kadirgamar lecture at this institute that now bears his name. Before I say anything else, though, I should say one thing at the conclusion of 2 weeks vacation here. I love Sri Lanka. This is a truly amazing country, and we have had the best time. So I didn't ever think I was going to be able to come here without giving a speech. I have to say the last 2 weeks have been bliss because they've been free from speeches. But I did, when I was asked to do this speech, I wanted to do it not simply as a mark of respect to the country, but as a mark of respect to Lakshman and all that he achieved and accomplished. He was a brilliant lawyer, and I know something about brilliant lawyers since I'm married to one. He was a distinguished statesman. He was also renowned internationally. When he died so tragically 10 years ago, the outpouring of respect and admiration for his life did not just come from Sri Lanka, but his many friends and admirers around the world paid tribute to all that he had achieved in his life, not just for this country, but for the cause of peace. He was a huge believer in and practitioner of also equality between people of different faiths and religions, something that fascinates me and occupies a large part of the work that I do today. He believed in a Sri Lanka in which all people were equal under one law. So, Mrs. Kadirgamar, thank you so much for having me give this lecture in honor of your husband, and it really is a genuine honor to be here with you, with so many distinguished members of society in Sri Lanka, and to offer you my thoughts at this very important moment, almost this junction between the past and the future, where Sri Lanka presently finds itself. I'm just back, in fact, from the Middle East. That was my one break in my holiday. I went back to the Middle East for a couple of days where I tried to make a contribution to the peace process there. This was actually I think it's now my 150th visit to Jerusalem since leaving office. Although Shri once pointed out to me, it's not actually the number of visits you make, it's the progress that counts. Which I didn't think at the time was very supportive, by the way, but it's unfortunately true. So not all peace processes end in success, or at least it can take some a very long time to succeed. But in the experience of Northern Ireland, we did. But it's worth pointing out that we succeeded after, well, on some calculations, decades of conflict, on other calculations, centuries of conflict on the island of Ireland. And there's an important lesson in itself for realizing that however tough things seem and however intractable problems appear, it is always worth striving for peace, because you never know that moment at which peace suddenly becomes possible. Here in Sri Lanka, for many, many years, you had conflict of a terrifying nature in which so many innocent people lost their lives. Today, the conflict has ended, and the pursuit of reconciliation has begun. Now, each conflict always has its own characteristics. And therefore, when you compare, for example, the experience in Northern Ireland with the experience in Sri Lanka, you have to do so with some caution, because the circumstances are so different. But having had experience now of different parts of the world since leaving office, including but not limited to the Middle East, it's true that conflicts come in a range of different circumstances and with an array of different characteristics. But it's also true that peacemaking and reconciliation has some characteristics that are common to whatever circumstances you find yourself in, or whatever the origins of conflict were. And with peace comes enormous opportunity. And we see this and we can feel this. Just as visitors to Sri Lanka today, we can feel the sense of possibility in the air. And I think it's important for the country, and sometimes you need someone from outside to tell you there is a huge excitement about where Sri Lanka can go. So in your pursuit of reconciliation, you have many long-standing friends who want this to succeed, but you also have new areas of interest in the country and in what it can do from around the world. Even in these 2 weeks that we have been here, certain things are very clear. This country has a remarkable beauty and a remarkable variety of beauty. It's got an extraordinary history. When we went to see Anuradhapura, I'm not sure about the pronunciation there, but anyway, but this extraordinary ancient civilization, now in the process of being excavated, and as each stage of the excavation proceeds, we see the quality of the civilization. It's a remarkable thing. And actually, when I went back and was talking to people in that couple of days I spent in the Middle East, and I was telling people there about the city and the rock with the presidential palace on top. I'm going to get the pronunciation wrong again, but you know the one I'm talking about. So you're good. Yeah, that one. So, and you see the extraordinary way that they built that palace and that whole civilization around it. And 2 million people living in the main city all those centuries ago. So the history of this country is a history that is profound and would be a subject of fascination to people coming here. You have natural wealth in resources, many different resources. And for the British, most important, tea. Look, because I travel the world today, I travel the world trying to get a decent cup of tea. You know, because the British we care about tea. You care about tea. Okay. And most places you go in the world, they may think they're great countries, but they don't know anything about tea. You know, you go to I won't mention any names, superpowers, roughly 50 or so states in it, and you get your tea and you think, it looks like dishwater. And then you taste it, and it tastes like it too. So to come here and have a decent cup of tea, that's such a blessing. But you've got this abundance of resources. You've got obviously fantastic potential in tourism. But you've also got trade agreements with your neighbors that offer amazing opportunities for business to come and invest and locate here. And then, of course, most important of all, for any country in the world today, you have your biggest resource, which is your people, who are kind, who are generous, and who want the best for their country. So there's so much to be proud of and so much to hope for. Yet for decades, this country, despite all its beauty and its history and its resources and its potential, it was defined by conflict. And conflict is always hard and bloody and unforgiving. So, right now, as peace has come, we have to look upon this as a supreme moment of opportunity and possibility. But we have to recognize one other thing, which the Minister, Mangala, did so well in his introduction. The peace is a beginning. The peace gives you the chance to create something new. It doesn't in itself create it. When we did that Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland in 1998, it actually took us another 9 years before Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness sat down in government together. And throughout that period of time, there were ups and downs and difficulties and crises and times when we thought it wasn't going to be possible. So when there is peace, you have the opportunity. But the opportunity's got to be seized, because reconciliation won't come unless there is much more work. So I could identify, I think, based on my experience not just in Northern Ireland but elsewhere, I would identify, I think, 7 principles of successful reconciliation. The first is the continued absence of conflict is essential. I know it sounds a statement of the obvious, but it's very, very important. Security matters. Lakshman understood this very well. This is why he spent so much time and energy, and to such great purpose, on waking the world up to the LTTE. And we have to say constantly, as we pursue reconciliation, and when people still feel a sense of grievance, as is inevitable, we have to say, whatever your grievance, whatever your disagreements are, nothing justifies the acts of terrorism. So to make peace last, that cycle of violence has to be put into permanent suspense. Because what terrorism does is it is not the act of terrorism in itself that is wrong, simply. Of course it's wrong. But what it does is it creates division. It creates a reaction. I've never come across a situation anywhere in the world where once there is terrorism, then there's not a reaction from the forces of authority, and then there's a reaction to the reaction. And so it goes on. And that's why you can't reconcile where there's violence. What we had to understand in the Northern Ireland situation was the first thing we did was to create the circumstances in which the violence stopped. But we then had to create the circumstances in which it carried on stopping. And that wasn't easy, but it was absolutely essential. And if we hadn't done it, we wouldn't be in the position we are today. And right now, of course, we see the terrorism around the world. And I could take any of the terrorism hotspots anywhere in the world, and I can promise you one thing. a majority of people in any of those countries don't want it. They don't want it. Even in the places you may think are the most war-torn, out in the Middle East now, in places like the north of Nigeria. And actually in any of these places, the vast majority of people don't want it. But what the terrorism can do is it can create such sectarian division within a community that even if people don't want it and don't like it, they get caught up in it. So this is for reconciliation to succeed. Never lose sight of the fact. The very basis of it is the absence of conflict, and that has to be maintained. The second thing is that once that happens, then you need a framework for the future that is fair. And let me explain what I mean by that. In a conflict, there will be disputes, disagreements, divisions. That's why there's been the conflict. But if you want to resolve the conflict on a basis that's sustainable, you need what I call a conceptual framework that allows people to understand the nature of the accord that's being offered to them. In a sense, what's the deal? Okay, what do we say is going to, what is the framework that governs our view of the future? In Northern Ireland, for example, the conceptual framework was very simple. We said, okay, you have a Republican movement that believes in a united Ireland. And you've got a unionist movement that believes in Northern Ireland remaining part of the UK. So the conceptual framework we adopted was to say, whilst the majority of people want Northern Ireland to remain part of the UK, the principle of consent applies and that majority decision applies. Okay. And of course, that means at this time that Northern Ireland remains part of the UK. But we said alongside that, however, in return for that, under the law, people are going to be treated equally. Because for a long time, there's a large feeling in the nationalist and Republican, the Catholic communities, that they weren't. So we had a conceptual framework, the principle of consent balanced by equal treatment. In the Middle East, it's land for peace, 2 states for 2 peoples. Now, the problem in getting there is vast, of course. But actually, the conceptual framework is quite simple. And one of the things, by the way, that's most frustrating about the Middle East is in the case of Northern Ireland, there is still no basic agreement as to whether United Kingdom or United Ireland. But we found a framework that people can see is sufficiently fair that they're prepared to manage that disagreement within that framework. In the Middle East, what is frustrating is there is actually in principle agreement, 2 states for 2 peoples. But the facts on the ground contradict the hope of peace. Now, for Sri Lanka, you will have to work out your own framework for the future. It'll obviously, you know better than me, the main issues that go into that. Issues around devolution, around the guarantees of rights, around development, and around dignity and fair treatment. But the second principle is really, you can end the conflict of the past, but you can't get reconciliation for the future unless there is a fair framework at the heart of it that is fair and seen to be fair, and that allows disputes and disagreements and divisions then to happen within a normal political process and not in a cycle of violence. The third principle is that particularly in circumstances where conflict has involved different faiths or different ethnicities or different parts of a country, for the conflict to be resolved finally and for reconciliation to work, two things must be in balance, and that is unity and diversity. And this is, again, a very, very important thing from around the world. You see, what happens today in the era of globalization is that the world gets pushed closer together. You know, it's a cliche now about the global community, but it's a cliche because it's true. Migration is pushing us together, travel is pushing us together. Everyone's got their devices, the little mobiles, and I don't know, all that technology pushes us together. So people across boundaries of race and nation and faith and culture are today mixing and mingling in a way that is on an epic scale compared with previous times. And this will only happen more. So, if you take the City of London, you know, when I first went to the City of London many years ago, and when I was brought up, for example, in the northeast of the UK in County Durham, communities were very homogenous. You know, communities were very similar. There wasn't a lot of mixing and mingling. But you go to London today, and it's an explosion of different cultures. I mean, it's done a lot for us, particularly on the cooking front. But it's, you know, London today is a vibrant, successful city precisely because of its diversity. However, here's the thing about diversity. You have to recognize difference, and personally, I believe we should celebrate diversity. But we should do so recognizing that there also has to be a common space in which all the different groups come and which is governed by common and shared principles and values.